What's up, people? Multiplier here, and it's episode number 8 of Ableton Basics, the series I started, 8 of 10, and today it's all about effects, which means kind of what all these stuff do, really. Now, obviously I can't go into each one in super big detail, otherwise I'd be here forever, but what I thought I'd do is just run down through each effect and tell you very briefly, roughly what sort of stuff it does and when you roughly might want to use it. Naturally, not in super big detail, but enough for you to kind of get a rough idea of what they are, because especially if you've not that kind of experienced in music production or you're new to Ableton, some of these words may not mean anything to you, like flanger might not mean anything at all, gate might not mean anything at all. Pretty much most of these, if you're extremely new to music, won't mean much, so I thought if I quickly explain them, it'll be all good in the hood. So, let's start at the beginning. First of all, we've got the audio effect rack. Now, it's not really an effect, now you can drag it onto things, but really it's kind of like a combination of effects. So if we open it up, you see we've got like amp simulation, got mixing and mastering, got performance and DJ, space, you got all these presets, each of which has lots of combinations of effects. Now if we just drag one out to show you, let's say we got, I don't know, mixing and mastering, punchy dance master. Now, the cool thing about these audio effects racks is they've got all these tons of effects built in. I wonder if I can show you them all. Maybe not. But they've got these kind of knobs here, which are the macro knobs now. These are kind of like parameters. So you've got all these cool pre-programmed set of effects, and you can change the things that you need to change with these knobs and leave alone the ones that you don't. So you don't really need to know necessarily how these things are set up or what each knob does. All you necessarily need to do is kind of play around with these knobs, each of which are normally reasonably self-explanatory. So they're kind of, I reckon they're pretty overlooked, these audio effects racks, the presets that come with Live 8 and Live 9. So have a dig through there. Definitely, it's worth a look through to see if anything pops up that you might find useful. Cool, auto filter. Let's get rid of that. It's like a filter, which I haven't got to filters yet, but it's a way of affecting the frequencies with a filter. But the cool thing is you can automate it, so you can make it go like that, or make it go, or you make it do pretty much however you like, whether it's using kind of like the attack or the decay, or using a sidechain to trigger it, or using an LFO, which is like a low frequency oscillator. So it's basically a way of automating the filter for stuff. So it's super useful. Whether or not it fits into your workflow and kind of how you might use it is up to you. I tend to use, if it's a synth, I tend to use the ones built into synths instead of using a separate effect here. But it's nice to know it's there. You got some cool presets as usual. So next one is auto pan, which panning is basically where you kind of, because basically where you got music, you got the left side, the right side, the middle, and then everything in between. So you can change the pan, like the position with this knob here. So like by default, it comes in the center, and you can move it to the left or to the right or a bit to the right and so on. Maybe you can just single click that little arrow at the top to bring it back to center. So that's kind of moving about in the left to right stereo space. Now this auto pan is a way of kind of automatically moving stuff around, whether it's kind of rhythmically or juttery or however you like. Just a way of moving the sound around. So it can be quite useful to play with. Obviously the amount is quite an important one, so whether or not you want to do it subtly or quite aggressively. But the best thing to do is, if you're still not quite sure what I mean by the stereo space or by panning stuff around, get a track or get a sound and drag on some of these presets and see what it does. So if it's around the head, simply drag on the preset, play the sound through, and you'll very, very quickly hear what's going on, especially if you have headphones on. Cool, so that's that. Next one is beat repeat. It's basically a way of like repeating small chunks. It's sort of like, have you heard much of Skrillexy stuff where it's like all stuttery and glitchy? That's the kind of beat repeat sort of sound where they just repeat sections of audio in certain patterns in certain ways. Tends to be used a lot more for live than kind of in the studio making a track. But because you can do some quite advanced things with this one, with filters and decays and randomness and all sorts of cool things. Best thing to do is have a play around with the presets, have a go. Can get a bit complicated, but yeah, have a play about with it. If it's kind of glitchy, stuttery effects you're after, beat repeat might be useful. Next one is chorus. What's the best way of describing chorus? Kind of hard to describe chorus. It gives it a little bit of airiness, a bit of width, a bit of character. It is hard to describe. Best way to kind of get a feel for the character of a chorus is by dragging on some of the presets again, like normal. Presets a great place to start, and then you can obviously play with the settings later on. But yeah, chorus is a nice way of adding width to quite a narrow sound. The downside is it won't sound quite as loud, and you can have issues when it plays back in mono. But yeah, have a play about with it. Just a cool way to add some character to things, especially if you use it only subtly. Next one is compressor. So super fundamental thing about like audio production is a compressor. Basically the idea is, as I explained in my last video, you've got like an incoming signal, which if you drag it onto a track is the track. And then you've got this threshold. So in this threshold bit, you'll see the meter fly up and down. That's the signal of the incoming track. Whenever the signal of the incoming track goes above the threshold, it will get compressed, it will get pushed down by an amount determined by the ratio. So if it's 1 dB above the threshold, it will get, and the ratio is 2, it will get pushed down 2 dB. If it's say 1 dB above the threshold, but the ratio is 10, then it will get pushed down by 10 dB, if that makes sense. So, and then it kind of gets held down by an amount determined by the release, and the attack is how quickly it takes for the compressor to kind of kick in. So you've got all these settings. If you're really new to production, you probably don't need to use a compressor, just because it tends to be used more for like fine tuning a mix, or if you're, say you've got a live recording, you want to kind of smooth things out, you can use a compressor to do so. It's got tons of different uses, everything from shaping sounds to tweaking the mix to all sorts of stuff. But yeah, it is a sort of thing you don't have to use it when you first start producing, but as you kind of get more experience, you will very quickly start to know what sort of tricks and sort of stuff you can do with it, and it will become second nature when you drag it out and how you use it. It's basically a way of shaping the volume of the sound in all sorts of different ways. Dynamic tube is kind of like, it's a way of adding kind of distortion harmonics to the sound. Now you can do it in a subtle way to add quote unquote warmth, or you can do it in a more aggressive way to get that kind of distorted sound, but that overdriven sound. But yeah, best thing to do, try some presets, see what it sounds like on certain sounds, especially basses and stuff. It works quite well on. So yeah, I'd say mostly on basses is where you want to use it. Cool. The next one is EQ8, which is the kind of the main EQ in Ableton Live. You've got all these little nodes you can pull up down to change the shape of the EQ, and you can click these little arrows to change which one it is. Relatively self-explanatory. Kind of, if you're unsure what this curve means, I mean, I personally think it's reasonably obvious. So you've got the low frequencies on the left and the high frequencies on the right, and then up and down you've got dB, so that's 6 dB up, 12 dB up. So you can see what this curve is doing. Around here, if you follow the mouse, at the peak, it's raising the frequencies just below 1K. It's raising those frequencies up 12 dB, and kind of leaving these where they are, raising these frequencies up a little bit, lowering these crazy lows. So you can very quickly, I mean, it should be, I think it's relatively obvious what this shape does. Just have a look at it and think about what it means when you remember that you've got dBs here and frequencies going left to right. And of course you can change the mode to be mid-side. This will be the side EQ, this will be the mid EQ. So you can do quite a lot with it. Best thing to do is just, again, start using it in a simple way, just doing basic things. And then if you want to do something more advanced, have a dig through, see what you can do. It's pretty cool, do quite a lot, and it's also doubles up as a spectrum analyzer as well. So when you play something through it, you'll see the frequencies and the range of frequencies showing up here. That's pretty cool. You'll use that all the time unless you have like a separate plugin to do it. EQ3 is a very, very basic EQ. So it's got the gain for the lows, gain for the mids, gain for the highs. To be honest, I wouldn't recommend using it. Just use an EQ8 unless it's doing something live where you might want a more knob-based thing. Erosion, it erodes the sound in 3 different ways, either using noise, white noise, or sine. It's kind of, I don't really that often use it. I don't know how much use there is to it, because it's not the nicest way of grittying up a sound. But yeah, have a play with the presets, see what you think. Most people don't use it, to be honest. External audio effect unit, you won't be needing any of that. Filter delay, looks quite complicated because it is reasonably, not that complicated, but basically a delay is when it repeats the sound after a fixed amount of time. That delay time is here, and it's done in 16th intervals if it's ticked to sync. If you tick it as time, you can change the time literally with the slider. So you can determine for the left and the right, and the left plus right, which is like the center, you can determine how long it is for the signal to repeat. And then each time it's repeated, it's filtered according to this filter curve here, which you can drag about. And then you can pan it as well. So you can do quite a lot with this filter delay in terms of getting really complicated, really advanced delays. I wouldn't recommend using it at first if you're just new to producing, which I imagine most of you are. It's more of an advanced delay unit. Something like simple delay is going to make a lot more sense for you, or even ping pong delay when you first start out. But yeah, you can. This is almost like more advanced delays with filters and more complicated stuff, and there's feedback, and yeah, it's pretty cool though once you get to grips with it. It's not too scary, and yeah, cool. So next one, flanger. Now it's quite flanger's got his own sound. No point in me explaining to you the physics of how it makes the sound. Yeah, you've got a whole bunch of settings. Best to play with the presets to get a feel for what a flanger is. And then once you get a feel for it, my normal advice is start off with a preset and then maybe tweak the settings, or just start from the beginning and have a play about until it sounds cool. And all these knobs are relatively self-explanatory, but to be honest, I'm not a big fan of the flanger, so I'm not going to recommend it. Delete. There are nicer ways to add character to a sound. Frequency shifter. Shift the frequencies. As you imagine, you've got an LFO, LFO is kind of like a low frequency oscillator, so it's kind of like to modulate things in a slow way. And they've got the shape for the oscillators up here, and all sorts of ways of determining the rate and the phase. So ways of determining how it moves about. Saying that, again, like quite a few of these effects, I'm not a big fan of it because it doesn't sound that nice. Just because when you move frequencies about, it doesn't sound that cool because it tends to move them about in an unmusical way, at least I think. But yeah, have a play about with it. It can be quite cool here and then if you want to change the frequencies of things, but to be honest, I think there are better ways of doing it. But yeah, have a play about. There's quite a lot of presets anyway, if you're getting a bit lazy and just want to see what something sounds with a weird effect on. Yes, frequency shifter, reasonably obvious. The gate is like a compressor, except it does a different thing. So it's got a threshold in the same way a compressor works. But then what it does is, this is really not that helpful picture, but what it can do is you can set it up in one of 2 ways. One way is when the signal hits a certain point, it kind of it kind of lets the sound go through, and then when it drops below that threshold, it stops the sound coming through. That's a very simple kind of explanation. And then you can have the opposite, where it comes through until it hits the threshold, where it then doesn't come through, and when it drops below the threshold, it comes through again. So you can have it one of 2 ways. But it gets more complicated because there's an attack, a hold, and a release. So whenever the threshold is triggered, the attack starts, and then and then the hold is kind of how long it gets held there, and then the release is when it drops back past the threshold, how long it takes for it to kind of release back. And then you've got the floor, so it gets quite complicated. Even if I gave you an example, you wouldn't really be able to see what's going on by hearing it. Best thing to do if you're curious is Google gate, and there's loads of really good diagrams and pictures which kind of explain exactly how they work. But yeah, have a play about with it. Really useful for like drum sounds especially, and drum loops, just for getting cool sounds. It's cool to stick them on like, to stick gates on reverbs, for example. So if you've got a reverb coming off a drum sound, gate would be a great way of processing that reverb. So it's a slightly more advanced processing trick, but yeah, look it up. I know that sounds like me telling you to look it up when I should be telling you, but it's really hard without a picture, and I can't be bothered to bring one up. Cool. That's a gate. Maybe I'll do a tutorial on it later. Cool. Glue compressor works the same way as a compressor, except it's using Cytomic's like compressing engines from their glue compressor. Glue compressor is only available in Live 9. It's like the compressor from before, but a little bit nicer to use. It just looks a bit prettier. Works a little bit nicer. It says Cytomic on it. Booyah! I don't really use it, to be honest. I use a plugin, so I can't really tell you how good it is. But yep, grain delay. How long has this been? 16 minutes. Wow, this might take a while. Grain delay. So it's like a delay, which yeah, it takes a while. So delay is sound comes through and then it comes back after a certain amount of time. Now grain delay you can do loads of complicated stuff with. Like basically, grain delay processes the delay. So after the sound happens, when it comes back as a delay, you can process it in lots of different ways. So you can spray it, you can change the frequency, you can change the pitch, you can randomize the pitch, you can have feedback, change the time, you can do all sorts of weird and wonderful stuff. But it's basically, think of grain delay as a way of coming up with more interesting delays. So have a go with the presets, they're the best place to start. Or just get experimental and just randomly try shit. Cool. Limiter, like the compressor, it's a fundamental thing of the way music works. A limiter basically is a compressor, except with a really, really fast something time. I can't even think right now, but basically the way I like to think of a limiter is it sticks a limit on the sound coming through. Pretty cool, right? So if you've got the limiter, say, set at 0, if a sound comes in, this limiter is set up one way. So yeah, basically you've got like a ceiling, and you can push up the volume of the sound going into it. But if the sound is above that kind of ceiling value, it gets compressed down to that value. So it's almost like if you imagined the sound, the waveform, like if the sound coming through, it's almost like chopping the tops off. If you made the sound, kept turning it up until it hit the roof, and then you turned it up even more, it would just like chop the top off the sound. Now, how it chops that top off, each limiter does it in its own way. I personally wouldn't use the Ableton Live built-in limiter if you have some nice plugins available, just because the nicer plugin you have, the nicer way it will chop those tops off and do it in a more musical way. But yeah, you can use the Ableton Live limiter for just doing basic stuff. Just kind of using it for peak control. If you've got random spikes of audio, you just want to control and chop the tops off. Limiter's the way to do it. But yeah, stick one of those on the master channel when you're learning to produce. Other than that, when you're very new and you're not doing proper mixing, you don't necessarily need to be using it that much. Looper, similar to the beat repeat, it's not really used that much in the studio, so I won't really talk to you about it too much. But it's best uses for live production, for doing loop stuff. If you want to loop something and process the loop and do all sorts of cool stuff, Looper's the thing to do. Now, multi-band dynamics is basically a 3-band compressor. So each band it's really bad because you can't see what band is where. You've just got these values, but it's almost like you split up your sound into 3 bands, like the low frequencies, the mid frequencies, and the high frequencies. You can determine which are defined as the low frequencies and the high frequencies, but it allows you to compress each of those frequencies in their own way. Again, it's a more advanced mixing thing. It's nice to know it's there if you want to use built-in Ableton Live stuff. Now, I've been saying a lot that I don't use Ableton Live effects, and I've been using plugins. That's just, again, a common way of dance music, especially, in fact, all music, you use third-party plugins just because they're a little bit nicer, give you better results, and just do things in a nicer way. But the Ableton built-in stuff's pretty cool. You can still make amazing tracks using just the built-in stuff, so don't worry. Overdrive, similar to dynamic tube, basically the same sort of idea, except you do it in a more frequency-based way. Again, best thing to do is just to play about with it. It's a way of adding those kind of subtle distortion, harmonics and stuff in. Delete. Phaser, similar to the flanger, it's kind of got its own sound. Best thing to do is play with the presets. It's a cool way of adding width and adding character. Much prefer it to the flanger, but best use it in a subtle way. Otherwise, it will sound a lot like a phaser, and you'll have lots of issues. And yeah, the standard phasey sound isn't that nice of a sound. But if you use it in a subtle way, it's a really cool, nice way to add a bit of character. Ping pong delay, like a delay where it basically pings the sound from one side to another. It's a nice way of adding some width to a sound, either subtly or unsubtly. And it's a nice way of doing it without controlling the left and right individually. So literally, this is the amount of time it takes to send it from one side to another, and you can filter each delay up here with this filter, and you've got feedback and dry wet. Nice and simple. Use that quite a lot because it's pretty cool. Redux it's like a bit reducer and a down sampler. It's a way of like adding more grit and characters to a sound. Adds it in a really aggressive way. Again, best thing to do is play about with it. There's not many settings, so just drag it out as it is. To be honest, you won't be using it that much, I don't think. But yeah, it gets used quite a lot in dubstep, but at least it did get used a lot in dubstep as part of the processing. But yeah, it's just another way to add a lot of grit and character. It works quite cool on a return track, which I'll explain return tracks on next video. But yeah, I much advise it to go on a return track if you're going to use it in a subtle way. Resonator, to be honest, I don't even know what that is. Never use it. Ignore it. Reverb, super important one here. Reverb is a way of adding space. I should probably do a separate tutorial on it, but reverb is basically whenever you hear a sound and it sounds like it's in a space, whether it's in a room or literally an outer space or in a factory or a cathedral or wherever really. If it sounds like it's in a space, it's because basically there's some reverb on it. What that reverb does is it calculates loads of like reflections, because my brain works out the space that something's in based on the reflections it hears. So if I blindfolded you and put you in a room, when you started talking, you'd have a rough idea of what kind of room and what kind of space you're in. That's because without you realising it, your brain is hearing the reflections when your voice bounces off walls and stuff. So when a lot of times when we're making music, if we don't add any reverb, the sound sounds like doesn't sound like it's coming from anywhere, and it sounds really kind of boring and just like it's synthetic. Whereas if you stick it in a space, you add some reverb, even in a really subtle way that you can't really hear, it just sounds like it's coming from somewhere, and it's like a real sound coming from a space, even if it's a synth that you're sticking in the reverb. So yeah, reverb's super important. To be honest, I always advise just start with the presets. There's tons of presets here, all sorts of reverbs doing all sorts of different cool stuff. And despite what some people say, I'm quite a big fan of the Ableton Live reverbs, just because there's pretty much always a reverb that will do the job, no matter what kind of reverb you're after, whether it's a really short reverb for like a room reverb for like a snare or something, or whether it's you want some mental thing that's like outer space or mega flexion, like just some ridiculously over the top reverb that sounds like it's on another planet. You've got that as well. So pretty much anything you can do with the Ableton Live reverbs. And if you're going to tweak anything, maybe the decay time or the stereo might be some of the ones you play with, or dry wet. But to be honest, yeah, just start with the presets. They are good presets, to be honest. And if you're not making a track with any reverb at all, it will probably sound a bit weird because reverb's in basically everything. For saying that, use reverb with caution. Once you start using reverb, when you first start using it, it's easy to go way over the top, and then you just get this sea of reverb and it sounds horrible. So use with caution, and you will get a feel for it after some time. And yeah, like Redux, or more importantly than Redux, people normally stick reverb on return tracks for reasons I'll explain in the next video. But yeah, reverbs almost always go on return tracks. It's just a lot easier. Cool. So nearly there. Crikey, this is a long one. Saturator. Saturator is basically, it's like dynamic tube and overdrive. So where it adds kind of distortion harmonics, but it does it in a different way. It's almost like a limiter combined with an overdrive. It is hard to explain what the sound of a saturator. It's almost like if you've heard distortion, that's basically what saturation is. Now, distortion isn't always aggressive. It can be subtle. In fact, analog warmth is basically distortion. So don't think distortion equals bad or distortion equals aggressive or anything like that. But yeah, saturator is a much overlooked plugin. Much overlooked effect in Ableton Live. While I use like Isotope Trash 2 now, I still use saturator every now and then because it's quite cool and there's a lot more you can do with it than people realise. And it's things like you've got all these different types of ways you can saturate the sound, like Wave Shaper. You got all these settings and you can make mad stuff with it. And then I mean, look, it's all mental and shit. So you can do lots of cool stuff with it. Yeah, I'd say if you're really new to producing, might be as simple as just loading up a preset, or I don't know, like warm up lows maybe, or just simply pull it out and crank up the drive, and you get that classic distortion. But yeah, it's almost like, think of a saturator as like the best distortion effect in Ableton Live. Cool. Simple delay is very simple delay. It's like delay except without all the fanciness of like filters and pinging around and pitch shifting. It's literally a simple delay, which a lot of pros use all the time as well, actually. So you don't always need a fancy delay unit. Sometimes a simple delay is all you need. Yeah, delay is a good way of adding width, by the way, if a sound's sounding a bit boring and unprocessed. Spectrum, already got one out. It's basically a way of analysing the frequencies. So if you want to see exactly what's going on with the frequencies, what the spread of frequencies is, especially important for looking at the sub bass, because knowing exactly what your sub bass is doing is really hard to tell by your speakers, because kind of how your speakers are set up, what speakers they are, what room you're in, all makes a big difference in how the sub bass sounds. So a lot of people, including me, basically mix and process their sub bass by eye, and you need to use the spectrum analyzer to do that. And of course, lots of settings, but to be honest, you don't need to change the settings at first. It's only when you start to use it in more detail would you start to change the settings, and in which case, just kind of have a look and figure them out. It's not too big of a deal. What setting does. Cool, nearly there. Utility. Wish this wasn't this far down the list, because I'm sure loads of people have turned off by now. But super important plugin. Much overlooked as well, especially when people are new to Ableton Live. It just does really useful like utility stuff. So if you want to change the gain of something and automate, say like the gain of something over time, you want to basically automate this gain knob here. You don't want to automate the fader. Why do you want to do that? Because let's say you're automating the gain of something, like so you're bringing a synth in slowly over like 8 bars. Now you don't want to use the track fader, because then if say when you're mixing the track you want to bring down the sound of the synth like say 2 dBs but across everything, you'd then have to change all your automation. Whereas if you just automate with this utility, with this gain knob, then you can kind of change the sound of the whole lot using this track fader here, and it's just a lot nicer that way. So yeah, use this track fader to change the relative level of the track. But if you're doing some like effect with the volume or a transition with the volume, automate this gain knob here. It's something I overlooked when I first started producing, like most people, but seriously, it makes life so much easier once you start doing it. So yeah, you can also analyze. You can like swap the left and right sides with this here, which is quite cool. If for some strange reason you want to swap the side of something over, you can control the left and the right separately. You can control the panning, so you can automate the panning here as well, which can be quite useful. And you can change the width as well, which is something that's really useful. So let's say you want to take away all the side content of something and just leave the content in the center, drag it down to 0. Or if you want to do the opposite, get rid of everything that's in the center, drag it to 200. So it's a really simple way of adding width in a really basic way. It'd be quite good to just say drag it up to like 150, and that'll get rid of some of the middle content, but leave enough of the middle content in there for the sound to still sound proper. Now you can add width in lots of other ways, but this is just a nice simple way of doing it. And yeah, if you want to make things narrow, just do the exact opposite, drag it to 50 maybe, or 0. So yeah, don't overlook utilities, super useful. Vinyl distortion, but virtually never used. If you want to add that vinyl effect of like crackling and the vinyl distortion, use this, maybe use a preset or two. But to be honest, very rarely use it. Maybe if you just want to add some effect in a weird way. Vocoder, basically that, like if you hear the Daft Punk kind of robot voices, that's basically a vocoder that's doing it. That's that kind of sound. So vocoder is normally used on vocals, but it can be used on all sorts. It can be used in all sorts of ways. I'm not that into vocoders myself, but it's just a cool effect. Like normal, start off with some presets, or maybe have an experiment if you want to try and come up with some cool noises. But yeah, just another way of getting a cool different sound. But the word won't mean anything to you until you play about. So yeah, like all these effects, do play about. Now, it's 30 minutes. Not sure how many of you actually got this far. Hopefully I've cleared up a few things and given you a rough idea of what these effects are. If there's any in particular you want me to kind of do a more in-depth tutorial of, let me know in the comments or on Facebook and I'll do that. Cool, it's been a long episode number 8 and let's do episode 9.